watching Actuary 101 with me, Prakriti Singhal. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel. Also hit the bell icon so you never miss an update of my upcoming videos. So far, we have seen the national level equilibrium in the curve where we said that aggregate demand was supposed to be equal to the national income, and that is the equilibrium level of national income. Now we are introducing the full employment level of GDP into the diagram to understand what is the inflationary and the deflationary gap. So, looking at the previous diagram that we have done already, so we know that this was the 45-degree Keynesian line which represented the Y curve, that is the income curve, and here we have the planned expenditure which was E, which was CD plus J. So the national level equilibrium was at this point, let's say this is YE. Now we introduce the full employment level of GDP. Full employment level of GDP means that all the resources in the economy are fully utilized. So there is no level of unemployment. So that means the demand is equal to the supply for labor. So basically, as many as people want the jobs, they are able to get those jobs that suit their skills. However, even at this level of employment, there are still some phases of unemployment. They can be in the terms of seasonal, regional, technological or structural unemployment, which we are ignoring for the moment. But however, if we say that here the full employment level of GDP is equal to this equilibrium level of national income, that means this is the point where even the national income is in equilibrium and the GDP is at full employment level, then we can say that there is no demand deficit unemployment. There is only equilibrium level of unemployment and there is no demand deficit unemployment. Now, let's look at this point, say A. So, if suppose the full employment level of GDP is at point A on the y-axis, on the y curve, then we can see that suppose this is YF here, then we can see that YF is greater than YE. That means the full employment level of GDP is greater than the equilibrium level of national income. Now what happens is that there is more capacity in the economy to be producing more goods and services than there is demand, because at this point you can see that the demand is less and the equilibrium and the full employment level is higher than this. So this gap A minus B is known as the reflationary gap or the deflationary gap. We also call this as the deflationary gap, which is due to the deficiency of demand from the full employment level of national income. So as we can see, there is a demand deficit unemployment. So it would be better to increase the demand by that much. So if E were to increase, say, by this much, by the deflationary gap, then we would say that the new equilibrium level of national income would reach here, because this is the new intersection. So if this is E dash and this is the original Y, then this is the new intersection point. So the national income will be in equilibrium at this point, and this means that the national income is increasing by the gap YF minus YE. So whatever was remaining over here, it is going to increase, and thus YF is again going to be equal to YE, making it at the full employment level and the equilibrium level of national income. Now let's look at the opposite case where the full employment level of GDP is here, say. So this is the Y curve and say this is A. Now we can see that the equilibrium level of national income is greater than the full employment level of GDP. So what happens here is that we'll say that this is a demand pull inflationary gap. So that was the deflationary gap, and this is known as the inflationary gap. Here you can see that the demand is higher and the employment level is lower. So what will happen is that to meet the demand, because the demand is so high, the prices will go up. The general level of prices in the economy will go up, and that will cause inflation. So when inflation occurs, what will we have to do? We'll have to reduce the demand. And by how much? Again, by this quantity B minus A, we'll have to reduce the demand. And when we reduce the aggregate demand, again the curve will be now lower than the initial curve. It will be E dash over here. And when we reduce the aggregate demand, income would increase by the quantity by E minus by F this time. And we'll again reach the point where by F is equal to by E. So in this case, the government will have to take steps in order to reduce the demand, and on the other hand, in the other case, the government would have to take measures in order to increase the demand, because the demand was deficient, and that is why the unemployment was rising. This is the inflationary gap, and this is arising due to demand pull. Basically, demand is higher than the full employment level, and that is why we'll have to reduce the demand in order to come to that price. Now, having looked at these two cases, we can draw a conclusion that unemployment and inflation cannot occur at the same time, because when there is a deflationary gap, there will be unemployment, that is, there will be demand deficit unemployment. When there will be an inflationary gap, there will be inflation and no unemployment. So we can say that unemployment and inflation are inverse of each other. They cannot happen at the same time. So to draw the aggregate supply curve with respect to prices and GDP, we can draw it this way. Now suppose the full employment level of GDP is at this level. So till this level, the prices will not increase. There will be no inflation, but supply can increase until you reach the full employment level. But once you have reached the full employment level, the supply cannot increase, and that is why the prices will start to increase and will cause inflation. So the supply curve becomes vertical. And this is our aggregate supply curve with respect to GDP and prices. So to look at it again, we'll see that in order to reach the full employment level, you will employ more and more resources, and without increasing the price, the supply can easily increase. But once the full employment level of GDP is achieved, it is not possible to increase supply, because there are no more resources left in order to increase supply. And that is why an inflationary gap would occur, which will lead to the supply curve to become perfectly inelastic with respect to the GDP, because as demand increases, the prices will have to rise, because there is no other option of producing more goods. So you can say that up to the level of full employment level of GDP, the aggregate supply curve is completely elastic, is perfectly elastic. However, as soon as we reach the full employment level of GDP, the aggregate supply curve becomes totally inelastic. So this is what we can draw the conclusion from the diagrams that we have seen, the inflationary gap and the deflationary gap. However, in reality, this is not always the case, because not necessarily the firms will increase production on an increase in demand. They may also respond with an increase in price or along with an increase in production. So in that case, the aggregate supply curve would become something like this. But anyway, after the full employment level of GDP, the suppliers cannot increase supply, and they would only have to raise prices. But raising prices can also happen before the full employment level of GDP. Note here that output and prices are related positively. Why? Because output and prices can increase simultaneously. How? Because over here, if you see that until the full employment level of output or GDP, the output is increasing as well as the prices are increasing. However, we've already seen that that inflation and unemployment are negatively related. Now, note that unemployment and inflation need not always be negatively related. Why? Because first thing, when you look at unemployment, it is not only caused by too little demand, because we've seen that unemployment is generally demand deficient. So it is not necessary that unemployment is only caused by too little demand. There can be other factors that affect unemployment as well, such as there can be structural unemployment, which can also lead to a very high level of unemployment, even at the full employment level of GDP. Now, coming to the inflation, we've seen that inflation occurs due to very high demands. Now, this is not the only factor that affects inflation. In fact, there can be other ways that inflation can occur, such as cost push inflation, which can raise prices even when the demand is not as high as expected. Supporting this argument, we have the Phillips curve, which shows an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. Diagrammatically, this can be represented as something like this, where we have inflation on the y-axis and unemployment on the x-axis. So, if you try to draw a curve to show the inverse relationship, we will get a curve something like this. Now, this can either be wage inflation or it can be price inflation. In both the cases, it will be inversely related to unemployment, and this is what the Phillips curve showed. Now, the Phillips curve seemed to have disappeared after the mid-1960s. There were some explanations that the economists came up with the disappearance. So, the first explanation that we had was that inflation and unemployment are not only caused due to demand factors, they can be caused due to other factors as well. As we have seen, there can be some level of equilibrium unemployment present, which can be due to other factors than demand. They can be due to factors such as structural, regional, technological, or frictional unemployment that may exist. Also, inflation can arise due to cost push factors as well, that the cost of production has risen and that will lead to an increase in the prices. So, there can be factors other than the demand that affect unemployment and inflation, which can cause the Phillips curve to shift towards the right and not completely disappear, in fact. So, the second factor that came across was expectations. So, higher expected inflation may lead to a higher actual inflation, which will lead to the Phillips curve again to shift towards the out, and in the long run, it may become a vertical line for one level of unemployment. There may be different levels of inflation rates. So that is why the Phillips curve may have become a vertical line and not actually disappeared. The third factor that we come across was inflation targeting. Now, what happens when inflation targeting is done? That the government or the economy sets one target for the inflation that is below the actual inflation. So, suppose right now the currently actual inflation rate is 6% and the government or the economy aims it to be low as 3%. So they will take necessary steps in order to achieve that 3% level of inflation. And if this is successful, then what will happen is that for all levels of unemployment, there will be one constant inflation rate, and that will lead to a horizontal Phillips curve and not again disappearance of Phillips curve. Now let's look at all these factors one by one and understand exactly how these mechanisms work. Now, we have seen that the inflation expectations have a major impact on the Phillips curve. We've seen that in the short run, it tends to shift outward, and in the long run, it becomes a vertical line. Now, let's look at how this happens practically. What are the steps that are involved to make the Phillips curve a vertical line along the long run, when in the short run, it has been shifting outwards? So, let's see, this is the original Phillips curve. Now, we know that as expected inflation increases, the actual inflation also increases. So, to cater to that, let's say this is the Phillips curve at expected inflation is equal to 0%. So, if expected inflation rises to 3%, then what will happen is that the Phillips curve is going to shift outward. Let's say this is my new Phillips curve with expected inflation as 3%. Now, again, let's say that the expected inflation increases to 6%, say. So, the Phillips curve again shifts outward and becomes something here. Now, let's assume that this is the point where there is full employment. So, basically, there is no unemployment or only equilibrium level of unemployment. Now, this level of unemployment we can also say as equilibrium level of unemployment, or you can say it is a natural rate of unemployment, or you can also say that it is the natural rate of inflation actually accelerating unemployment, that we call as NAIRU, natural accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. So all these three names are given to the same level of unemployment which occurs at the equilibrium level, where demand is equal to supply, but there is still some labor force which is not getting employed due to other factors. Now let's say we are starting at this level which is A. So if the government wishes to reduce unemployment from this point, say to U1 or U dash, then the government will have to increase aggregate demand, because as aggregate demand is going to increase, more and more production is going to be required, and that is why more employment will be there. So to reduce unemployment, the government will have to increase aggregate demand. So if the unemployment reduces, we know that there is an inverse relationship between inflation. So what will happen? Inflation is going to rise. So inflation rises, say, by 3%. If the government increased the aggregate demand, or say reduced the unemployment by 3%, then we say that the inflation increased by 3%. Now what happens is, we are here at point B, say. So from A we have reached point B. Now if the inflation if there has been an increase in the inflation, it is only in the price inflation we are looking at right now, because the workers were not expecting any increase in their wages. So now what happens is that there is since there is an increase in price, the workers will start to expect an increase in the wages as well. So they will expect a wage inflation as well. Since there is an increase in inflation, so the nominal aggregate demand is going to increase at the same rate, but the real aggregate demand is not going to increase as much, which means that the total revenue generated is certainly going to be more, because marginal revenue is going to increase, but the quantity sold is not actually going to increase that much, because there is a difference between the nominal aggregate demand and the real aggregate demand. Nominal includes inflation, real does not include inflation. So we are saying that nominal aggregate demand is increasing, but the real aggregate demand is not increasing. And that is why unemployment shifts back to the level U star, which was the original level of unemployment. And since there has been an increase in the expected inflation of wages, we will see that since there is an increase, the Phillips curve shifts outward again because of the expectations. So ultimately, we reach this point C, where the unemployment is again the same at the natural rate, but the inflation has increased to 3%. Now, if the government again wishes to reduce unemployment, that means to increase employment, it will have to increase the inflation or the aggregate demand by more than 3%. So 3% more than what it had increased earlier. And ultimately, we will reach this point, which is at 6% inflation. So we will actually, from A point we reach B, from B we reach C, and from C we are reaching D by the same mechanism how we reach from A to B. Because from the original Phillips curve, if we are trying to reduce unemployment, the workers' wages expectation increases, and that is why, and there is a lower real aggregate demand, and this continues to happen at every stage until we get a long run Phillips curve, which is a vertical curve. So you can see from very short run Phillips curve shifting outside every year, there will be a vertical long run Phillips curve in the long run. So this is how we see that the accelerating effect happens for this Phillips curve using the role of expectations. Now we have looked at the accelerationist theory of inflation, but we also have the new classical economist theory, which is known as the rational expectations. Now, what does rational expectations say? That if aggregate demand increases, the firms expect it to be reflected by an increase in prices and wages, which will reduce the encouragement to firms to produce higher goods in quantities and reduce unemployment, and thus the Phillips curve can stay vertical even in the short run and not in the long run. So whatever is happening in the long run in this phase can also happen in the short run, because the firms expect all these situations to occur in the short run itself. And that is why we can say that the short run Phillips curve can also be a straight line. Now we have the expectation of unemployment and output, which says that if aggregate demand is increased at a gradual rate, at a slow rate, then the firms can be encouraged to produce more goods and services and to invest in production, which can lead to the unemployment levels to reduce and also cause the Phillips curve to shift towards the left, which can counteract the inflation effect that causes the Phillips curve to shift towards the right. Now, in the next segments, we will be looking at the other factors, the other explanations that were derived to explain the disappearance of the Phillips curve. That's all for today. We're going to continue from here in the next video. If you found this video useful, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.